After more than 20 years, I am back on the air at WHCL. Dave Bolger here. Welcome to Had I Known, where we'll explore the Hamilton College experience with, well, the hindsight gained after those 20 plus years. Has it changed? Was that experience the same for me as it was for others? And what impact did that experience have on the careers and lives of its graduates? I'm also interested to understand if the experience of the 90s has had any impact on the students of today. Do the things we lived through back then make any kind of impact or mark on what the Hamilton experience is current day? These are all things we're going to try and dig into, and we'd certainly love to have you come along for the ride. Give us a follow on Twitter at Had I Known Show. Again, at Had I Known Show. Let us know what you think. Our guest this week is Matt Glassman, PhD. Matt is a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. We had a great chat about his recent visit to the Hill and how his 4 years at Hamilton shaped his career and really led him down a path that in many ways he didn't expect. Matt shares some great words of wisdom about politics and what his ultimate regret was after his 4 years at Hamilton. So I hope you enjoy my chat with Matt Glassman, class of 2000. So WHCL, man, welcome back on the air.
Yeah, WHCL, here we are. I was there in January. They put me up in Bristol, and so of course I went down in the basement, and obviously WHCL isn't there anymore, and it's just one of those things that's like slightly disconcerting that there's just like a meeting room there with some whiteboards and no radio station, because I feel like obviously it wasn't there forever before we got there, but I just feel like, well, that's where the radio station is. That's not something that changes. You go in there's a studio and some kids laying like vinyl records you never heard of down on a turntable, right? So none of that's true, right? I don't know when you were up there last, but the thing that blew my mind in January is sort of like the demonstrated pride in the school. Like,
really?
Yes, like you, Dave, I cannot tell you, you would not believe it. Like, when we were there, people wear like a Hamilton rugby shirt, or maybe they were a Hamilton football shirt. Like the number of students there now wearing just plain Hamilton, logoed gear is just through the roof. And it really makes me feel like, more like sort of like a, cynical Gen X scumbag like everybody was in the 90s, right? It's, F this, right? I'm not going to wear a logo of a school, right? And sort of maybe, reflective of sort of a lot of the sentiment on campus too, just angry at the time we were there. But the number of kids walking around in Hamilton sweatshirts, Hamilton sweatpants, Hamilton t-shirts, just not associated with a sports team, not a fraternity shirt, none of that, just regular Hamilton stuff blew my mind. It's like, this is what I would expect to see at like, a school with great Division I athletics or whatever, where everyone has a lot of Alabama pride or Ohio State pride or Michigan pride or whatever, which was it was kind of cool to see, right? It felt like the students were like, there's something like they were very proud to be at Hamilton. And not that students weren't proud to be there when we were there, but like that would have been like, what are you doing wearing a Hamilton sweatshirt? It's just this cynical, sort of like I said, like the cynical Gen X attitude.
Well, that's one of the main themes I think that I'm going to continue to press on with the show is exactly that, is that those of us that were at the school in the late 90s were the first to really live through, the epic res life decision, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I vividly remember getting a letter home the summer before I started college saying they've decided to take away fraternity houses, and we didn't know what that meant.
Right.
Like I went on a football recruiting trip and went to a party at the DU house, and I was like, oh, this is cool. But other than that, I didn't really know what it meant. So then I spent 3 years, you spent a good chunk of your time there being told that the school, essentially sucked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All these people who had lived through it. And I'm curious, with literally 25 years of hindsight to see, has that changed? What impact did that have? Knowing what we know now about college campuses, seems like maybe it was a good decision, but, it's kind of one of the things I want to explore and talking to alums of that era and faculty of that era and seeing how things evolve. So to have been there recently, it's fascinating to hear the change.
I definitely, so there's like the little things that are weird. Like I was up there I was like the outside reviewer on the government department's DC program, which the dean's office is reviewing and the government department's reviewing. So I was there for like 3 days meeting with tons of faculty, tons of students, and just, talking about this program. But also I was just like absorbing the campus. And so there's like little things that are weird about that from our time. Like, like talking to students, like if I say, "Oh, where do you live?" and they'll name something, it's like, is that a new place? Is that back behind TDX? They have no idea what you're saying. Like TDX doesn't mean anything to them, right? It's just Wolcott or whatever. So like the lingo of sort of the old fraternity houses, they're all still sitting there, right? But they're all sort of gone from memory. And like you think about it, it's like there's kids there now who were not even close to being born, right, when we were there,
right?
And so like it's like trying to have someone tell you about what Hamilton was like in the early 70s for us. And I do feel like, having seen it, a number of times since I graduated in 2000, I do sometimes feel like shortchanged by what happened in the late 90s. Because I think like what happened at Hamilton was like emblematic of like bigger changes in colleges at the time, right? There's like this feeling that we were there and we were part of there of like, one foot was still kind of college like it was in the 40s, right? I always think of like the internet at Hamilton because like I think it was my freshman year, it might have been your freshman year, where like the upperclassmen didn't have email addresses or like they had to sign up for them. But like when I got there as a freshman, I just had one. I had like a connection to the T1 line. And like if I wanted to communicate with another freshman, I like emailed them. But if I wanted to communicate with like a junior or senior, it was like go right on their whiteboard outside their door. It was really sort of like very old school.
Right.
But also more to that, I feel like we were there right at the cusp of when like the consumerism of college took hold, right? Like the thing that blows my mind there is the career center there now. Like the way students like come to the college with a career, like motivating what they're doing, even at a liberal arts college like Hamilton, right? Where it's sort of like even, secondary to what you would see at like a state university or something, just the kids who are already pursuing, like the summer after my freshman year at Hamilton, like my summer job was like, I was a painter for the town and I painted buildings, right? Or, and kids mowed, still mowed lawns and drank beer for their summer break. Like that's gone, man. You're either in like the internship game or you're not, right?
Right.
But if you're not, you're like doing something wrong, right? Like summer's not a time.
I think that's true in high school now.
Yeah. And so that's a big change that we were kind of at the crossroads of too. And then I think like the consumerism, like, I teach and I have parents email me like about their college students' grades. And it's like, it would never have dawned on my parents to email a professor. They didn't know what classes I was taking, right? Like it would mortified me, right? And so like, but I'm not saying that to like make fun of parents now or kids now, but like it's part of like kind of like college is like a consumer commodity where like you're spending this much money going in, you want to see the end result. Like when I got to Hamilton, I had no idea what the end result was going to be, and it wasn't sort of like a reason I went there.
How sustainable is that? I mean, if you're living it, you spend time on college campus now, and as your career, what is that going to continue?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the pandemic alone may pierce a bubble into all this because I don't think kids are going to, I don't think families or young adults are going to pay the kind of, private college tuition to have online classes. And I think there's going to be a pretty big crisis at the universities about how to adapt to this. Cause there's a general problem in the United States where more and more people are going to college and we're not building like elite colleges. So the competition to get in them is higher. So people are willing to pay whatever it takes because there's still sort of like a good return on it. But the return's getting less and less. Spending $300,000 on, Ivy League or Ivy League equivalent education is no longer giving you sort of like just at a brass tacks monetary return. It's no longer giving you sort of the runaway return it once was. Part of it is like the elite schools now compete on all the non-educational things, right? So, and you can see this at Hamilton, like the luxuriousness of the dorms alone, right? Is like, well, they got to compete. It's a market and they're competing with other schools. And it's like, well, if you want to have like this lofted, beautiful 2-level apartment at the top of Kirkland, right? We could show you that, right? And I was like, I went into Kirkland and I was like, oh my God, I lived here when it was, the same as it was in the 20s or whatever.
I mean, I have to imagine, and everything I've understood about Hamilton is it's resulting in a better student body.
Oh my God.
A higher quality student.
I don't think it's even comparable. Well, I think college students nowadays are just, so when I'm teaching, they just know more. And it's because they're good at gathering information. It doesn't mean they're like analytically any smarter than we were, but they know so much stuff and they know how to find stuff. Like a good college student now is not just someone who's, thoughtful and studious about their work and discipline. It's someone who's like a good, information resource specialist. Like they know how to work the internet to find things out. And I'm constantly blown away at how good students are now. And also sort of like, how dedicated they are. I don't have, hard data on this, but my perception is students are drinking a lot less and playing video games a lot less, or at least prioritizing that less. Again, because I think so many of them are more career driven.
Yeah.
And I think they see it. I don't know if it's fading, but I think post Great Recession, I think a lot of college students get the crap scared out of them.
I do have to say that, speaking for our generation, so many of us were pretty good at finding things on the internet as well.
For sure. But again, like the, I
don't know. It helped me with my career, but
right. It was, the very first time I met you at Hamilton was accepted students, day in, it must have been in April 96. So I was a senior in high school, and I came down into the basement of North, and you and Hazard were sitting on a couch watching the NHL playoffs, I think. And I sat down with you and started talking to you. And, you just ho-hum. We were talking about the game. Hazard didn't really say anything to me. And then out of nowhere, he's like, here's the deal. And I'm like, okay. He's like, college is awesome. They give you this high-speed internet, all the porn you can eat. And that's it. And he just never even looked over at me. He's like watching I think we were watching a hockey game or a Ranger game or something. And he's like, okay, yep. The internet is good for something. Thank you, Hazard.
The grizzled vet as a freshman in college.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He's like, I've been through the ringer, dude. Don't bother me. I'll tell you how it is here.
That's one of the areas I wanted to get into with you. So let's talk about high school senior Matt Glassman making the decision to go to Hamilton.
Looking back on it, it was more random than I'd want to admit. I had a couple things in my head when I was a senior in high school. I grew up upstate in the suburbs north of Albany, and I'd never lived near a big city, and I really didn't want to go to school in a city. But I wanted to go to a small school. Both my parents had gone to school in cities, and they had drilled into my head how cool it would be to go to a school where you could be in a classroom and actually talk to the professor. And so that kind of set up. And so I think I had in my head I wanted to go to a small school. And so I was a good student. And I was looking at a bunch of small schools. I didn't want to go far away from home. All these things that, like, if I'm advising a student now, I think are kind of weird. Like, it never even dawned on me I might want to go to school someplace where it's warm. It never even occurred to me to be like, be like, oh, if you go to school in the South, it's always warm. Never even crossed my mind. And then we had a family friend at our church who their two sons had gone to Hamilton, like class of like 90 and 92. And I got talking to them, and they're like, oh, you should check out Hamilton. I'd never heard of it. And I had been checking out like Middlebury, Tufts, and Williams. And so I drove out to Hamilton, and this is like the contingent part that's so weird, is we went to look at Hamilton and Colgate. And we decided to go to Hamilton in the morning and Colgate in the afternoon. And I get to Hamilton, and I thought it was great. Just like looking at the campus, I was like, man, this is really cool. This is like not anything I expected. I don't think I'd ever seen a college campus that looked like that. It was one of the first places I visited, and I was just like, wow, this is gorgeous. Seems like
it's very quintessential college. I mean, if you have an idyllic view in your mind of what a college campus is, if you know that certain era, it screams that when you walk on the campus. That's what sold me on it.
Yeah. And then, so I went to Hamilton. I went to Hamilton. I was like, oh, this is great. And then we drove down 12B to Colgate, and I got car sick on the way to Colgate. And I was like car sick, and we get to Colgate, and I go in a dorm, and we walk in this dorm, and like, I don't mind the smell of stale beer. I certainly didn't when I was 18, but we walked in like this dorm room they're showing us, and it just absolutely reeked of awful stale beer. And like, I was already like car sick, and I was like, oh man, this is terrible. And so, I for reasons I came to discover later, I think I would have been happier at Hamilton anyway than Colgate, but I always do wonder if I'd gone to Colgate in the morning and Hamilton in the afternoon, if I would have the exact opposite experience. And I didn't, looking back on it, one thing that I loved about Hamilton was that if you want to try something at Hamilton, it's like you just did it, right? Yeah. So you're gonna go play rugby, go play rugby. You want to be in a play, right? And I always felt like even at Colgate, it was already a little too big to get sort of that advantage of a small school.
One of the things that always blew me away, and I know this is true virtually on every college campus, but I think because of the size of the school, the access that you had to, what felt like world-class athletic facilities, rare movie screenings, concerts. I mean, just, legitimate acts that would come through, comedians.
Yep.
And you end up doing these intimate settings, like in the events barn with a few hundred people.
Yep.
And it always blew me away that one, we're able to pull that sort of talent, and two, that you just have this access. And man, did we take it for granted.
Totally. And the funny thing is, I feel like in some ways, that has become even more stark now. Like, it was certainly true that the school was really good through like CAB about signing up bands and certainly comedians and sort of that stuff that would come to the barn. But I do feel like, we were in that period of change at Hamilton where the school like knew what they wanted to destroy, but didn't quite have a feel of what they needed to do to replace it. And I always felt like that late 90s period had that feeling of like, okay, they didn't want sort of that old students just do whatever the hell they want when they're not in school. We run the classes, and then students, like the 70s model of college, right? Where they just hang out at the fraternity houses and drink or do whatever they want. And we're not going to try and plan that stuff. And then now, post 2000, the school really got heavily involved in sort of building up like programming for students, just blowing out the outing club and things like that, and really providing the resources to really make that stuff run. And I feel like we were kind of stuck in the middle where they were trying to feel their way around to how they wanted that to go.
Yeah.
And so they were beefing that stuff up, but they really hadn't quite done it. And I do think that like overall the school's a better place for how they changed it. I think the way they went about it probably could have been done with a lot less animosity and consternation. If they had done the buildup of the other stuff first, they might have found themselves in a better spot, at least with sort of like, the young alums of the time and the current students and things like that. The other thing is that the students are so good. They're just so good. And sometimes I wonder, it's like, well, would I have gotten in here if I had to try and compete to get in here?
I know. There's no chance. No. Oh my God. No, I would not. No.
And like, that's great for anyone we're probably out too long now for it to matter much, but like the value of the diploma is going up, but like the competition to get in there and just the number of applicants they get. But then sort of like the thing that shocks you the most, literally the most, if you went during the 90s and you just step back to the day, is that the student body is finally not 94% white or whatever. Like you just walk around campus and you just blown away by the number of African American students and Latino American students that are on campus, Asian American students. And I think that's, attributed to one, the intense competition to get in there now.
That is a topic that I fully intend to dig into as we build this show up and trying to line up some guests to talk about that, because that is another area as we talk about the evolution of the school from our time there to now I'm very interested to dig into.
It's great to see. Like part of you feels like when you're there, like especially when we were there, you kind of feel like nothing ever changes, and like there's this big momentous change there, but it's almost like it isn't even going to happen, right? Like this is the weirdest thing when we were there is like there were plenty of people who were like either convinced or working hard to try and reverse the changes. And it's like, can this place, whether you agree with it or not, is like even possible for a place like this to sort of like move forward in any way, or is it just tied too much to its own history? And they seem to have sort of like that certainly is not true, because they have, transformed that place in unbelievable ways.
So let's go back. So we were talking about young high school Matt, who makes what seems like a great decision to go to Hamilton College.
We turned out great, yeah.
So now you're walking around for 4 years on the Hill.
Yep.
How does choosing a major come into play? You're starting to map out, I don't want to paint houses over the summer. Right. I want to get a real job.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that process.
So I sort of knew, or I thought I knew what I wanted to do. And it was one of those things where like, I grew up in the upper middle class. Both my parents were like teachers and, sort of like in that class of people. And if you live in upstate New York and both your parents are like in education, like you live a very fine life. And I just want to be a high school history teacher is all I want to be. And I just didn't even like give it much thought. I was like, I'll finish school here and then I'll figure out how you become a high school history teacher. And that's what I'll do. And that was really my trajectory, almost to like almost definitely to a fault. Like I did not think about jobs. Like I was a sophomore, I was a junior. I was like, I'll just be a government major, take some history classes, do that too. And, I'll teach high school social studies and it'll be awesome because, it's what I want to do. And it's what I always loved thinking about and studying. And then, I can remember clear as day, I was like a senior and, Richard Powell was a professor in the government department. And he's like, you ever think about going to graduate school? I was like, no, like literally, no, I have not. He's like, you should think about it, man, because if you're setting your sights on like being a high school teacher, he's like, I think you would love being in like academia and, being like a professor at a college. And it literally had never dawned on me, which is like, he's like, how much of like a moron was I when I was 21? And so I was like, okay. And then I was like, well, what do I do? And he's like, well, you should apply to some schools. And him and Phil Klinkner helped me apply to a bunch of schools. And like, again, another decision I made that worked out like really for the great, but which I did not like do any sort of like of the necessary like due diligence, like of what to do. They're just like, you should totally do this. You fit right in. I just took their word for it and it turned out great. So either they were really perceptive about me or I got really lucky. And so I was, I had finished up with a government major at Hamilton, and then I went straight to a PhD program at Yale, which was both a great decision and a huge mistake. Like going straight to graduate school at a major university out of Hamilton, I really needed to take a year off and like work or do something. And I had a total inferiority complex. I got there. I had been, standing on the rugby field 3 months earlier, like just drinking beer, like goofing around at Hamilton. And then I was like meeting all these students in my program who were like, oh, I finished Harvard and then I took 2 years off to go work in Russia where I picked up 2 languages. And I was like, what did I get myself into here? And I was miserable. And that was when the first time I really learned how much I appreciated Hamilton.
Did you feel prepared?
Not the first 2 weeks, but so it was crazy because I remember I was taking this class and, I read the books we were supposed to read for the class, and I got in the class, and there's like all these students who had gone to universities, they'd gone to Yale, they'd gone to Harvard. I literally really didn't even know what a TA was. Like, I really didn't even know. Then I'm sitting in this class, and all these kids are like talking about this book with the professor, and I'm sitting there listening, and I'm like, they didn't read the book. It's like, what the hell? They're not reading the books? I was like, and I'd actually like read the book. Maybe I'm an idiot. I'd read the book that week, and then like it dawned on me that like it was all sort of like a veneer. And then, and then the thing that came out that really was the thing that I think I now take most away from Hamilton academically is like somebody, whether it's probably Ted Eismeyer, somebody at Hamilton taught me how to write, and taught me how to write well, or at least well enough that I had a comparative advantage, because pretty quickly, I realized at Yale that one of the things you can do at like the big universities, if you had gone there for undergrad, is you can hide and skate through. Very quickly, I realized that. And also like they had picked up bad habits of shortcuts at universities, like not reading the books and things like that. And you don't have to read the books, you can not read the books at Hamilton too, but it was a lot harder, right? Because you're going to be sitting in a class of 23 people and you're going to feel like a moron if someone calls on you, right? And so, yeah.
Well, you're saying that like I have experience in that. What are you trying to say, man?
I think back to like, I would write a paper in the government department and, Phil Klinkner, Ted Eismeyer, like it would come back like covered in red ink. And like, I'd be like, Jesus, and I'd be pissed. But like someone's actually like carefully reading like a 12-page paper in undergrad at Hamilton wrote and like spending this much time thinking about it and responding to them. And like, I was the TA reading those 12-page papers at Yale or whatever. And for those undergrads, and I couldn't give them that amount of time. I just didn't have the time to do it. And that's something I totally value. Again, like teaching me to write, but also like being able to get sort of that personalized attention. Now, I mean, you got to take advantage of it.
We heard over and over again, right, in our 4 years there, that writing intensive. Yes. It was the place that was going to teach you how to write. And
yes.
It got to the point where I think one would roll their eyes at it.
Absolutely, you roll your eyes. It was like a cliche, like, and you see these alums talking about Hamilton. Well, we were undergrads. They took these alums being like, yeah, it's so great. You learn to write and think analytically and public speak in some ways. And I just you roll your eyes like, well, that's the cliche about this school, right? As they try to sell, but it's true. And it's very weird saying that now as the alum has been out for 20 years, right? Because I'm sure some undergrads are going to roll their eyes when they listen to this.
And I tell you, I've gone through my career, over the last probably 10 or so years interviewing people for jobs.
Yeah.
And, working in advertising and marketing, I can't tell you how many marketing majors and advertising majors I'd interview, and they think that they'd have a leg up on people. And those people scared the living hell out of me.
Yes.
Because you've been spending your life studying advertising? And then, you get these liberal arts, students coming in. I've interviewed quite a few Hamilton students across the board. In fact, one recently at my current job, and, this guy was one of the standout candidates right off the bat, and I didn't even push him because he was a Hamilton grad. He just stood out for himself, and you could just see that level of education, that liberal arts education, makes you stand out as a candidate.
Yeah, and it feels like such a cliche to say it too, because it's like there's sort of that like, well, what are you going to do with like a philosophy degree? What's that going to get you, right? And so the rejoinder always was
that's total BS. Yeah, no, screw those people.
Yeah. Right, and the rejoinder always was like,
I mean, screw the philosophy majors.
Yeah,
I have no time for that.
I'm still not sure what they're doing, but
exactly.
But the rejoinder to that always was, well, when you come to a place like Hamilton, you learn to think, and you learn to write, and you learn to communicate with people.
All right, so you wanted to be a high school history teacher.
Bag that.
High school history teacher.
Bag
so
that.
How does one go from that to being called a political scientist in the New York Times,
right?
And a Twitter influencer? I'm not sure if I should call you Professor Glassman or Blue Check Glassman.
Yeah, I don't have a blue check yet. I'm still.
Oh, you don't?
No, I don't.
How do you not have a blue check?
That's you take that up with Jack at Twitter, man. I don't know. In some ways, like it's better now not to. Like it's a really sort of like badge of shame for a lot of people. So I had a weird thing going on because I went to graduate school in political science. And that typically leads a lot of people to academic careers, right? You get a job in a government or political science department and you teach. But that wasn't really like my thing. Like academic political science is great and I love reading it and I love the people in it. But I was always much more of a sort of real world politics guy. I had grown up outside of Albany. My father's job was a patronage job with the Democratic machine there, like straight out of the 1800s, right? Like he had his job because the party gave it to him. And we didn't have to like directly kick back money to the party, but we had to go to every fundraiser and donate the maximum. It really was a racket in a machine politics sense. And so I was exposed to sort of like, on the ground, real politics in like an absolutely scummy machine very early on, which has been really funny living in Washington because people always talk about Washington. Like, this is like the cleanest politics ever, man. You should go to like a city. People like complain about Congress. And so I, all through high school and, in college and grad school, I was always working on local campaigns and stuff like that and doing sort of actual political work. And so when I was finishing up my PhD, I looked at some academic jobs, but I also looked at a lot of non-academic jobs. And I was on the job market and I had a bunch of interviews at liberal arts colleges because I sure as heck didn't want to go do sort of just like hardcore political science research as my job. I want to be a teacher. I love teaching. I love being in a classroom. And so I was looking at some liberal arts colleges, but also some jobs down in DC. And the first place that gave me an offer was the think tank, the public think tank in Congress, the Congressional Research Service. And they gave me an offer to come down there and, a week to decide. And my wife and I were just like, all right, let's go to DC, man. It's going to be great. And never really looked back from that. And so I worked at Congressional Research Service, CRS, for almost 12 years. There, my expertise was in sort of legislative procedure. And so it's a nonpartisan shop and you just help the members of Congress and the staffers in Congress, with, how the House and Senate floor works. And then also my other big thing was separation of powers. So anytime any member of Congress staff wanted to look at options for fighting with the president, or things like that, I was typically involved, which was an amazing experience because it was exactly how I love to approach politics. I had a front row seat to everything. I was involved in everything, but I didn't have to sort of join the sort of partisan fray.
What is it? What time frame are we talking about here?
So I moved down to DC in 2006, and I was there on the Hill at CRS till the end of 2017, and that was great. So I worked with hundreds of different members of Congress and staff, hundreds of different offices and staff there, and really the sort of like I loved it because it was a perfect combination of an academic-ish job, but a politics job. And like I said, I got to be in a lot of rooms to get in the front row seat, sitting in the corner, and they'll call on me if they need something that I might know about, but I didn't have to work sort of like the 110-hour weeks that the poor kids on the Hill work, making no money, sort of like just in the trenches of the politics. And it was awesome. And then I didn't ever intend to really leave that job. I wasn't looking to leave. Think tanks downtown in DC and other outfits had talked to me about coming downtown, but my job on the Hill was so great. It paid well. It was interesting. I was like, it was like I was doing it was almost like the thing I would be doing as like my hobby, like reading about politics. I was just doing instead for money. And then I got a really great offer, to leave the Hill and come to Georgetown right at a time when being on Capitol Hill was being less and less interesting for me. the sort of the partisanship on the Hill had grown to such a level by 2017, and sort of the divide.
No.
But I mean,
Really?
but like in a way that wasn't even close to true, even 5 years earlier. Just like, and so the number of members and staff on either side in the Hill who wanted sort of any sort of nonpartisan advice or expertise had really kind of dwindled to a large degree, and there was divided government. So nothing was moving. So instead of like helping people write bills and think about how to get the bills through with the House and Senate procedurally, I was like just sitting in offices with, young kids, helping them write messaging bills that were really just PR, things to push out. And that became less and less interesting. And also the partisanship made nonpartisan outfits like CRS or like CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and places like that, much more like, risk averse, because so many of the partisans were then charging us with being biased. And so like the administration at CRS, I was less and less able to write stuff for the members and staff that was at all interesting or helpful. By my last year there, most of what I was doing was I stopped, writing memos to members of Congress and staffers. I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to take face-to-face meetings so I can tell them how it really is. Right. It was really ridiculous. I would just go into work and I'd line up a pile of meetings over on the Hill, and I just go over the Hill and just talk to people, in different offices all day and help them think through their strategies. Which was really fun, but I also saw it as like a dead end. So I got this really good offer to come over to Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown, which is one of the centers that's part of the public policy school there. And it's technically sort of an independent nonprofit within the public policy school. And now I do the same thing. I think about Congress all day, but I'm just over at Georgetown. And so I do a lot of working with federal agencies or lobbying groups and teaching them about Congress and how to strategically think about Congress. And then I do a lot of consulting back to the Hill, where I just go back to the Hill and work with the committees or staffers over there. But I can say no to them now. I'm not actually working for them on the Hill, which is great because I can pick and choose the projects. And doing all that work, my responsibilities over at Georgetown, that probably takes half my time. And the other half time, I'm just I can do whatever I want there, which I couldn't do when I was at CRS. I couldn't write op-eds in the Post or anything like that, or do that sort of stuff, or do sort of serious Twitter. And so I picked up that on the side, which I love doing, because I like,
You mean you couldn't subject us to 400 tweet long threads?
Oh, you wouldn't follow me if you didn't love it.
For those listening, hold on. For those listening, what is it? Matt Glassman
312.
At Matt Glassman 312.
Yeah, it's a brilliant Twitter.
You can join
the party.
Nate Silver, Alyssa Milano. Come on. Name drop some of the followers. Come on.
Oh my gosh, various members of Congress and a lot of like
the director of Rounders.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. But yeah, it is a weird world. So Twitter is such a weird place because part of me is like, so there's like this old fashioned way to like influence things in DC, which is to like write op-eds and white papers that circulate around town to try and influence policymakers. And like, that's great. And it's fun. And it really feels sort of fulfilling when you write an op-ed and it's in the paper, but it's like a ton of work and a ton of like, agonizing interactions with editors who then won't run your story. Or you can just like blast something out on Twitter and like get like this instant gratification of like a couple people, it's like a dopamine shot, like 100 people like this or whatever. And like, it's like, well, am I reaching a bigger audience or is this just all like ego BS, right? Where I'm just like trying to pump myself up at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday because I don't feel like writing something that people who actually can make decisions are going to look at. And so I have this weird back and forth about Twitter, whether it's like really great to like let a big audience see that. Cause like, it's funny, man. The change in the world from like blogging to Twitter is crazy. Like I had a website, I used to blog a lot and, get like 1,000 hits or something. It's great, right? 1,000 people read something. And now it's like you blog something and like 8 people read it, or you can do a tweet storm and it gets like 100,000 impressions immediately. It's like and I don't think the incentives are very good because I really try to use Twitter in a way that discourages sort of the pissing matches and the face slapping and sort of the BS. Yeah. And even I
was going to ask you, you're quite active, a large following. Mm-hmm. Twitter very quickly turns into a cesspool on just about any sort of topic.
Totally.
But I admit I certainly follow you and read most of what you post, not all. Yeah. You start getting into card games. You get into card games, you lose me a little bit.
Oh wow!
Although you turned me on to Sushi Go, and my kids thank you for that.
Oh, well, congratulations. That is the game.
It doesn't seem like the nastiness follows you in responses and comments. Is that
Yeah.
true?
Well, yeah. I mean, I try very hard to, one is not do any sort of hack stuff. I mean, sometimes Trump will just annoy me so much that I'll do something that's kind of hackish, but I try not to I try to stay away from that and try to talk about things where I can actually explain something to people in a way that isn't any of the name calling or this or that, and try and actually give something people where they'll be like, wow, I'm glad I learned that, right? That's interesting to know. And I try to keep it on that level. And, I have my opinions about party policies and politics, but I try to do my Twitter mostly as just informing people about how politics works. And so I think I've set myself up in a spot where I don't get a lot of the flaming. Now, it's unbelievable because the minute I say something about Trump that's not terrible, where I say no, look, this is how the White House works or whatever, I get absolutely destroyed. I cannot believe it. And so it is tough. I mean, the main thing I don't do on Twitter is I don't get into any sort of arguing with individuals unless I personally know them and I know they're arguing in good faith. I used to be very egalitarian about Twitter. Now I mute people there's nobody's business. I just mute them.
Well, there's a certain power feeling in that as well.
I mean, I don't think I've ever blocked,
which is a different sort of endorphin rush.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever blocked. I don't think I've ever blocked anyone on Twitter, and I think it's because I don't want to give them the satisfaction to know I blocked them. I just mute them all. Okay. I probably have. I swear to God, I probably have 10,000 people muted on Twitter. Which is fun. But I mean, I do think that one thing I'm good at, because I did kind of grow up in scummy politics and I've been around it all my life, is that I'm pretty good at explaining sort of big thing politics down at sort of a level that, a smart, interested audience can really easily understand, and taking things that are sort of, going on and are really in the weeds in Washington and saying, well, look, here's what you actually need. Here's how you actually should think about this. It's not particularly complicated, but you just, if I just explain it very sort of this kind of, I think do you feel like there's enough of an audience for that? Not for you to be a Twitter star, but I mean, for the sake of our country, do enough people care about that level of detail? That's one of the things that panics me most, is that I think is in our entire lifetime, we've lived in a soundbite sort of culture, but it's gotten whittled down so much now to just right or wrong and zero sum game, that the nuances that I think often you try to bring to the conversation, a lot of people just don't care. Yeah, they don't want it. I think that. So a couple of things to say about that. Two things are true. One is I 100% agree with what you're saying. More and more people have sort of tuned out any sort of nuanced, rational thought, and they're just going to be partisans, right, of whatever stripe. It might be party partisan, it might be ideological partisan. They have their opinions, and that's what it is, and they know what's right, and they don't want to listen to it. So two things about that. I mean, we can't get through a pandemic and a quarantine without being that. I mean, right, and so the two things to say about that are, first, that you'd be surprised how important sort of I think in England they call it the chattering class conversations are. People in Washington or other people who are attuned to politics and generally are what you might call elites, not in sort of a status sense, but in terms of influence on politics, things like that, how much they do sort of take in information that's relevant and nuanced when they're thinking about things. And so from my perspective in Washington, when I'm trying to, impress upon people in DC, things like that, I think that can be extremely helpful for getting people who are, so because I'm in the third concentric circle, there's people with real influence on Twitter and in the government, and I'm 2 layers behind them. But sometimes I can say things that are important that will filter towards that direction. The bigger point though, and I think this is a mistake a lot of people make about politics, is it's okay if people are bitter partisans. Democracy works perfectly fine when you have these dug in sides, and people don't want to hear that, I think, because of two reasons. One is a lot of people have sort of I don't want to say fairy tale, but they have sort of a very sort of nice vision of how a democracy should work in their heads. And it goes something like voters sort of look at the different candidates and they see policies they like, and they choose a candidate because they like his platform, and then the candidates go and work to pass those policies, and then the voters look in the next election whether they did it or not and vote them out of office. And that sort of sounds good, and then we teach children that, but it's not really how democratic politics has ever worked. right? People tend to form partisan allegiances, not for policy reasons, but for sort of social identity reasons. It's funny if you talk to someone, it's like, why are you a Democrat? Why are you a Republican? Sometimes they'll talk about abortion or taxes or things like that, but often they'll tell you about where they grew up or their family or where they went to school. And these sort of social affiliations with the parties often become sort of primary in people's development as a partisan, where the policies are sort of secondary. You're not a Republican because you're against abortion and you're for gun rights and lower taxes. It's that you became a Republican sometime in your upbringing, and therefore you decided that you were against abortion and for lower taxes and gun rights and things like that. And so a lot of it, most of social science research says that sort of social affiliation is much more dominant in people's thinking, because most people don't think about tariff policy. They got better things to do with their life, and God bless them, they should, right? And so when they're looking for a position on tariff policy, they didn't decide to choose the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or Trump or not Trump based on tariff policy. They had some other reason they got to that partisan affiliation, which then gave them their policy positions for the most part. And this changed on the margins, but most voters, and it's totally fine. They take their cues from the party. They don't have a defined set of policies they believe in, and then they go seek out the party that matches those. Not at all. They have a party they believe in, and then they get the policies received from them. The big issue here is that we all grew up, basically everyone alive who's an American adult today, grew up in the shadow of the least partisan era in American history, which was the 1960s and the early 70s. And this was the era where the Democratic Party had both liberals and conservatives. The Southern Democrats were the most conservative people. The Liberal Democrats were the Northern Democrats. And the Republican Party had conservatives and liberals too. There were Republicans in the Northeast who were very liberal, much more liberal than the Southern conservative Democrats. And this is all residual of the Civil War. But if you look at any sort of the studies, the low point of sort of partisanship was this era in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people sort of mythologize that era, because you had the Democrats, the Northern Democrats and the Republicans coming together to crush segregation and to finally pass the civil rights bills. And it looked like bipartisanship saved the day there, and we crushed sort of the evil Southerners. And that's all true. The problem is that most people now use that as a reference point for what good political system is, or what normal political system is, right? Why couldn't we just get back to the time when Democrats and Republicans came together to defeat the bad guys, right? But the thing is, if you look at the longer scope of American history, that's absolutely the exceptional period, right? For all of American history, and in the vast majority of democratic countries in the history of the world, strong partisanship is how the system works. And the funny part is, in the 60s, you had all these sort of political scientists and other, people in Washington just wishing you could have parties that stood for something, right? Both parties were sort of these catch-all parties where you had very conservative people and very liberal people in both parties, and people just bemoan the fact, well, if the parties just stood for something, it would give voters actual choices. And so I think that it's a mistake. The other thing is people say there's so much conflict in politics because of the partisanship. And it's true there's a lot of conflict, and it's true there's a lot of partisanship, but they're not the same thing. Trust me, there's plenty of conflict in the 60s when partisanship was at its low. I mean, in fact, if anything, there's more conflict then. Plenty of people dying in the streets, fighting over the war, fighting over civil rights. And so, it's not that politics then didn't have any conflict. What it didn't have is the partisanship reinforcing the conflict. And people say they don't like the conflict, but when you get right down to it, what people don't like is they don't like losing. They don't like losing. And I give a talk constantly around Washington to any groups, that want to have me, about the basic nature of a democracy. And Congress is a place where there's going to be conflict. It's the public location of politics, and politics is a fight over who gets what. And
isn't there a view of there's conflict, which is debate and argument over what the right policy should be.
Yes.
Right. And then there's conflict of you're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. And then we're not going to work together. And
right.
There's this public view that it's the latter that's driving the day right now, which is, in fact, there isn't enough conflict because they're not even talking to each other.
Yeah. Right.
Is that a fair assessment?
I think there's something to that. I think that's what most when most voters say they don't like the conflict, it's not that they don't like the clash of policy ideas. It's that they don't
right.
they'll point to the bickering and things like that. And again, I think it's something that if we could remove it from the political system, you might choose to remove it. But the thing you don't want to do is take the next leap, which is to say, this is somehow brand new and this is going to be the downfall of the republic. I can promise you that sort of the bickering and that sort of conflict is age old in any democracy. We didn't invent it. And sure as heck, Barack Obama or Donald Trump didn't bring it upon the country. That's not to say that, the other thing I tell people that, if you want to take something nonpartisan away from the Trump era, and in some ways the Obama era too, it's that governance matters. Like, so many people, when they vote for president, right, they're picking what I call a legislator in chief, someone who agrees with their ideas about what Congress should be doing, what the government should be doing on policy issues, right? So they vote for someone because they want lower taxes, or because they want to ban abortion, or because the opposite of those two things. And that's totally fine. You can have your policy views. But the problem with that is it leaves out, particularly in the presidency, what is probably the most important feature of the presidency, which is that they have to govern. And a lot of people don't even get a sense of what that means. Like, Congress passes policies, right? They make choices, right? Like, we should have $3 trillion of support aid for various things to counter the pandemic. But then it's the executive branch, starting with the president at the top, who have to implement those policies. And I tell you, like, that's not easy. And that requires people who are good at solving problems and good at administrating and good at making tough decisions, and then good at selling those tough decisions to the public. And I think that's one thing people undervalue, and they undervalue with Obama too, because Obama was by my account, a pretty bright young politician who just didn't have a ton of experience governing. It's really easy to be a legislator in Congress. You vote on things and you send it out. And one of the worst pathologies in Congress is the idea that when you pass a bill or a law, you've solved the problem. Like, you've just got started solving a problem when you pass a law.
Right.
And the example I always give students is, if you look at like the CAFE standards for cars, it's a little law passed by Congress. It says cars have to get 18 miles a gallon in the United States, something like that, right? It just sets that threshold, right? That's well and good. But now you got to implement that policy, and you're over in the Department of Transportation or the Department of Commerce, and being led by the political leaders installed by the president and his program. And you got to figure out a million questions. How are we going to test the cars? What systems are we going to use to test them? How often are we going to test them? Are we going to test them at the point of import, or who's going to check who's going to monitor the regulations? And so if you look at that law, it's like 2 pages long. And then if you look at the regulations implementing it, governing it, they're like 500 pages long. And so managerial competence matters. And if there's one place I think, sort of the current administration has really struggled in the pandemic, it is sort of building up a policy preference they have for how to deal with this. And that's one part of it. But the second part of it is then going and being a leader and selling that preference to the public. Right. And I don't think Trump has been particularly good at that. I don't think Obama was particularly good at it either.
Well, we spend a lot of time talking about the president or the legislator in chief. Yeah. But I know it's your view that we should spend less time talking about that and more time thinking and talking about local politics.
Yes, 100%. If you're interested in political action, and I think Eaton Hirsch wrote a good book that came out this year called Politics is for Power. And the thesis of the book is that too many people in the sort of middle class and upper middle class, the educated class who wants to think about politics, too many of them have become political hobbyists. That is, they read Twitter and they learn a lot about politics, and they, post something on Facebook, or they sign a petition on Facebook, but they don't actually engage in the kind of work that changes outcomes in politics, that influences things, and they've forgotten how to do it. Whereas, a generation ago, most of them did know how to do it. And when people ask me, well, how do you influence politics? I always tell them, you just forget about the federal government. Just forget about it. And they say, well, what do you mean? I say, you got to get involved at the local level, because that's the place where you can actually make a difference. And you can make a really serious difference right away. And the thing is, local politics has such a huge influence on people's lives, and they just totally forget about it. Yes, the decisions made in Congress are important. Yes, the amount of taxes you pay ultimately can be decided there. Whether we go to war can be decided there, things like that. But really, on a day-to-day basis, it's your local government, particularly your school board, if you have children, who's making decisions that are much more impactful in your life. Whether to raise the property taxes and pay the teachers more, or whether to change the curriculum in your school district, or whether to build a new school itself, has a huge impact on you and your family. And it's so easy to get involved in politics there. I always see people saying, well, I'm going to send money to Biden, or I'm going to send money to Trump, right? I say, you're wasting your time. Both the presidential campaigns are going to have more money than they know what to do with, and they don't need your $200. Putting your time and energy and money into local politics is just instantaneously going to help you influence things. In my town, this happened just last year. The town council was making some decisions about business zoning that annoyed a lot of people. And one guy started a Facebook group and, started just banging on it that people had to organize. And he started holding meetings, and all of a sudden he had 500 members, and he ran for the town council and he blew them away. simply because he got people organized around an issue. And he did the hard work of going and knocking on people's doors and talking to them. And you can't do that for Joe Biden. You can't. It doesn't matter, right? There's a bazillion other people who are going to do that. Who you can do that for is someone who thinks the curriculum at the school or the policies the school board is setting are outrageous, and that someone needs to either influence them. If they won't change, needs to run against them.
What's going to get people to care about that to the level you're talking about? Because I think you're right. I think you make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But that's just not the sexy thing to think about or talk about, or certainly what gets covered.
It's funny. I remember when I was a painter, we were talking about that earlier in the summers. The guys who were sitting in the break room, who I painted with, who this was their full-time job, they read the local section of the paper cover to cover every day. And they knew what was going on in the town. They knew what was going on in the city, Albany, that is. And they could tell you everything about the political decisions and what the ramifications of those were, and how their painters union should think about candidates and things like that, because they had to.
If there are any current students listening to this, papers are a thing that used to have words printed on them that carried news. It's an artifact. You can look it up.
Yeah. I mean, so I do think that people do become attuned in self-interested ways once their kids hit the public schools. They think a lot about what's going on at the school. But a lot of them only go halfway, right? They'll go get a meeting with the principal because something's going wrong. They'll do sort of something that I think counts as politics, but some people don't see it that way. They'll get in on the PTA and start trying to influence stuff that way. That's great. Joining the PTA and making stuff happen there is that's politics. You're affecting who gets what. And or they'll join, the board on their HOA, or they'll join the board on their pool club or things like that. And those are all participating in politics, right? If you want to influence politics, you got to go have tough conversations. And a lot of people are, I told my dad was on the outskirts of the political machine in Albany, and we lived out in the suburbs. Even though we were part of the city machine, we lived out in the county, and they would always have my dad like run for office as like a sacrificial lamb out in the suburbs where there's just way too many Republicans. We always lose. And I would campaign with him when I was a kid, and I learned so many political lessons there. And one was like, he always had a smile on his face when we lost. I'd be like, why are you smiling? And he's like, we're not trying to win this election. We did a great job. We spread the party's message. That's all they wanted from me. Right. And so there's like this complexity of politics where people have different motives. My dad wasn't trying to win an election. He was trying to stay in good with the party. And then one time I got a little older, and I was like, why do you always bring me along when we go door to door? He's like, well, if there's a 7-year-old there, they're a lot less likely to slam the door in your face. Right. and it's like it's a tactic, right? But it speaks to sort of what you have to do. And like, essentially what we were doing is we were dropping the party's message. And so that's another reason. If I always tell people, if people are thinking about running for office, I said, just do it. Just do it. You won't regret it. And
so when are you doing it, big boy? What's the plan for you? Come on.
I am much more, I'm much more attuned to being, I like being on the appointed positions. So I should say I've won one election.
Too many doors have been slammed in your face.
No, I've won one election, a pseudo election in my life. I'm on the board at our, in Northern Virginia. There's all these like community pools, which have a terrible, nasty history from the segregation era, but now they're just sort of like nice neighborhood pools. I'm on the board of the neighborhood pool, so I did win that election to get on that board. I
have visions of you just wearing people down by going through the history of community pools in Virginia.
No. Oh, yeah. Well, so
okay, fine, Matt. Yeah, approved. Just get fine.
But I'm not. So I'm on an advisory board to the town council, and I do the PTA stuff. It takes a special person to run for elected office, even at the town level, even at the county level, and certainly at the congressional level. You have a thick skin. And, you have to be able to, fold your hands, in your lap and just hear people out at the grocery store. But anyone who is thinking about doing it, like I always say, just do it. Like, don't worry if you don't know how to run a campaign. Don't worry if you've never done it before. Don't worry if you think you have enough experience. You do.
Well, clearly you're putting this Hamilton education to use,
yes.
and it's done you good.
Yeah.
You've done good, kid.
Well, thank you.
One of the things, as we wrap up here, one of the things I'm going to try to do is stick with the theme of this show of looking back.
Yeah.
So the question for you is, looking back with, what are you coming up? You're on 20 years now, right? Almost 20 years?
Just past, it's 20 like this week I graduated or whatever.
Looking back on 20 years, had you known then what you know now, give me something you would have done differently, thought differently, things you would have tell yourself little Matt walking onto college
Yeah,
campus for the
totally.
first time,
Yeah.
wearing his flannel and
Oh my God.
listening to Dave Matthews.
Can you imagine? The number one thing I regret from my time at Hamilton was not just trying more things. I mean, I said it earlier, what a great place Hamilton was, because you could just, anything you want to do, you could just try, right? It was a small enough school where, like, if you want to try to play baseball, go do it, right? You want to go be in a play, go do it. And I think sort of the thing you can't feel in college until you're out is just how much free time you actually have, and also how low the stakes are. And everything seems so monumentally huge when you're a teenager, particularly if you like think someone's going to laugh at you for doing it. But the opportunities abound there in a way that really close off extremely quickly by your late 20s. And I think that the main thing I wish I knew now was how much I could have tried and even failed at and been happier, because everything I did there sort of like pushing my boundaries. I always felt like I was so happy I did. And I'm just sort of like regretful that I didn't try more things because I thought the stakes were a lot higher than they actually were.
Some good advice there from Dr. Glassman. You may notice that there was no proper thank you or send-off at the end of that program. Well, after 20 years of not being on the air, I couldn't go through a show without at least one technical glitch. At any rate, thank you, Matt, for being our first guest. It was a great chat with Matt. It was interesting to get into, what felt like at the time a cliche about the writing-intensive nature of Hamilton and how that really does have an impact post-graduation. His thoughts on the Hamilton cool of the 90s versus the Hamilton spirit of today's students, the overall caliber of today's students versus when we were there. And, the importance of local politics. And as Matt said, get out and just do it. If you're thinking about doing something, get out and do it. I raised my hand to do this show. And let me know what you think. At Had I Known Show on Twitter. Tell me who you want me to talk to next. Tell me what topic you want to cover next. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy your Sunday. And my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on this show. We're going to let Doc play us out. You got to have a little funk, a little jazz on your Sunday. So enjoy it. We'll talk to you next week.